Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event on identity. We want to thank you for taking time to join us this evening. My name is Justice Gatson, and I'm the founder of Real Justice Network. We're bringing this to you in partnership with Uzazi Village and with the Latinx Education Collaborative, as well as Alive and Well. We have some other partners. Abe, would you like to mention who they are?
Yeah. Some of our other partners are with Policy Link, and of course, thanks to Health Forward for being a part of this and giving us this opportunity to really uplift our communities.
Thank you. We want to thank our partners. And if you joined us last week, you know we had a really in depth conversation about colonialism and how that has impacted the relationship between Black and Brown communities. So we're carrying forward this week, and we really want to dig into the topic of identity. We have two amazing guests with us who will be sharing with you. I want to welcome Dr. Theresa Torres. Welcome. And I'd like to welcome Mo Del Villar. Thank you both for being our guest today. And, I want to go ahead and dig in here. We know that we haven't really had the identity discussion in depth in our communities the way that we need to. And we always find ourselves back here, especially when trying to work together. And so, we've been meeting for months now, and with the goal of building Black and Brown solidarity in Kansas City, with the goal of building Black and Brown power and creating something sustainable. And so we know that we have to approach this in a very authentic way. And that means dealing with and discussing and really digging into the issues, anti-Blackness, identity, all of it, colorism, all of it. So without further ado, I'm going to be quiet and let our guest go ahead and present. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Justice. I thought I would start just to do a little bit of a connection point between what happened last week and talking about that transition on identity as well as colorism and how does our identity and our sense of who we are in our broader community and within our groups as Black and Brown peoples in the United States. So as we were having a prep, one of the things that in discussion with Mo, she talked about, being her family's from the Dominican Republic. And so this identity of being both a Latina and a Black woman together can be rather, I'm not going to speak for, but that's kind of part of the complexity of what we're discussing today about identity. So I thought what I'd do is I'd share just a little slide, and I hope you can see it. I want to talk a little bit about how slavery and race impacted the Caribbean, but it also impacts Latin America in general. But I'm going to focus on the Caribbean. And my reasoning for that is because there's some interesting facts that a lot of people might not know, that there were a number of indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, and I'm focusing on the Dominican Republic. There were the Carib and the Arawaks, who were native peoples living there at the time that the Spanish landed in the Caribbean. And the Spaniards, as you know, we're going through the pandemic. Well, the Spaniards and the rest of Europe had gone through numerous pandemics, their own exposure to the plagues, the Black Plague, for instance. And so they were resistant to that, but they could also carry it and not even be aware that they were carrying it. So what they did was, when they entered this new world that had not ever encountered this kind of problem, a lot of the indigenous peoples died as a result of that. I mean, it just spread like wildfire once the Europeans settled in the Americas. So just so you know that. So when the Spanish, when they wanted, and as well as the British, later the British, the French, and the Dutch colonials came, they brought those illnesses, and a lot of people died. And particularly in the Caribbean, the focus was on sugarcane. There were lots of sugarcane because that's what the Europeans wanted and needed. And so that is a very harsh type of living. And the indigenous peoples who were left, there weren't that many of them. And they could run away and hide into the jungle. And so it wasn't so easy to find them because they knew the land better than anybody else. Plus a number of them died. And so that's when the whole bringing over Africans who were resistant to these diseases, because Africa and Europe were connected. And so they already had that internalized resistance. And so when the slaves were brought, I want you to know that they were put to work in mines and plantations. And so through other diseases and murder and overwork, their numbers decreased dramatically in a short time. So over and over, more slaves were brought to the Caribbean. So between 500 to 750,000 indigenous people living on the island where the Caribbean is today. That was called Hispaniola when Columbus arrived. That's what he named it. By 1514, Columbus arrived in 1492. So in 1514, that number of indigenous had dwindled to 29,000. So an estimated population of 750,000 to 500,000 dwindled to 29,000. So then slavery then in the Caribbean was quite different from what we saw in the United States and elsewhere when they didn't focus on sugarcane. For example, the sugar planters had to invest equipment for the mills, as their product had to be processed and as soon as possible. So, and it could spoil within 24 hours. So to make it profitable, they had to make these mills working 7 days a week. And at harvest time, some slaves might work up to 18 to 19 hours a day for weeks on end. So this is why we see this huge drop in population. I don't know if you can see that, but the numbers just kept having to go back to Africa, bring more slaves, and people just died. And they died in the slave ships, and they also died along the way. And that's an important part of history that of the Caribbean, that particularly when you think about peoples and the mixture of peoples in Latin America. And I wanted to note that also, particularly in the Caribbean. Okay, so that's our tradition from talking about colonialism. We cannot leave out the story of slavery and race and its impact. Okay, so I'll turn it over to the questions, but I thought I'd do this little snapshot.
Thank you, Dr. Torres, for sharing that with us. Before we get into questions, I'd love to give Mo an opportunity to speak, introduce yourself, and share some of your thoughts as well.
Hi, thanks, Dr. Torres, for this bridge. My name is Mo Del Villar. I'm the Legislative and Policy Associate for the ACLU of Missouri. I identify as Afro-Latina. As Dr. Torres mentioned, my lineage, my father's Dominican, my mother comes from South America and Paraguay. So all kinds of mixing and different types of cultures, communities, languages, foods. But as Dr. Torres was mentioning, there are a variety of ways in which we cross. And even in the United States today, 25% of people who claim Black identity also claim Latinx identity. And people in this, secondary diaspora hail from upwards of 20 countries. This is certainly not a monolithic group of people. This is a group of people that cross in so many different ways throughout history, and also tying a little into what Dr. Chavez was talking about last week, in movements, in ways that we have to work together as communities who are often marginalized, who are often among the last to get our rights and to get our voices heard. So happy to start jumping into any questions or moving forward, Edgar.
Could I share my identity? I forgot to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay, I am Mexican American, third generation, second generation, born in this country. My mother was born here. My grandparents came from Silao, Guanajuato, which is kind of the central plains of Mexico. My mother was a single parent. I really don't know anything about my father's side, other than I know he came from Ireland or Scotland. I suspect Scotland, but really don't know yet. I have to do my DNA test. But I can tell you what my uncle Bruno Torres told me when he did his DNA test. And I thought it was fascinating that my grandmother, who was from the second oldest gene pool, came. Her family came from where Iran and Iraq is, the central, where there's the Tigris Euphrates, and they traveled through the Central Plains, through Asia, over the Bering Strait, and into the Americas, into Mexico. My grandfather, on the other hand, was the European, and his family roots came from Spain, southern Spain, but he also had a gene that was muted that is often seen in Sephardic Jews. And I don't know if you realize, but there was a huge purge of Jewish people when the Spanish crown took over, forcing people. They forced the Moors, who had been there for 900 years, to leave the country or become part of Catholicism. And so a lot of Jews became Catholic and were forced to become Catholic. So this kind of purge and all of that, I think probably is why my family became such strong Catholics, because they really are. And going back as far as I know from my family in Mexico. So that's who I see myself as, a Mexican American, but I also see myself as a Chicana. And a Chicana is someone who has an activist heart, who's committed to social justice and works to try to bring about a better world that is more inclusive and equitable for all peoples. And so Chicana, Latina, Mexican American, that's how I see myself. And I know that my racial background would be both indigenous, European, and I do believe I do have African blood, given the connection with southern Spain and North Africa. So somewhere in there, I think I have a little bit of everything, and that's why the Mexicans and Latin Americans often call themselves La Raza, which means we are the people made of all the peoples in the world. Okay, so that's who I am.
I appreciate you sharing that, Dr. Torres. Something that I'm actually really curious about, Mo, I'll start off with you. It's interesting to hear both of you describe your identities, right, in these different places where we're coming from, these different intersections that you're seeing. So why do you think that we're often, I guess, distilled to just one term, right? Latinx, Black. Like, what are the positives about that? What are some of the negatives about that?
Right. Well, answering the first thing that comes to my mind when I'm answering that question is things like an election year where you're grouped in these large, wide swath demographics where people will say all Latinos will vote like this, or this issue is most important to this group of people. And sometimes that can feel, disempowering, because you may not feel that way because our groups are so diverse. Like I said earlier, Latinx, that term, Hispanic, there's a couple of different ways that people are able to identify themselves. And that covers 20, maybe 25 countries in the world. And then the African diaspora as well. As we know, this great mass migration from forced migration from Africa over to the Caribbean, South America. We, in this country, often think about race in such black and white terms, and a lot of those vestiges of slavery still narrate a lot of our dialect right now, our race relations. But the vast majority of slaves didn't come to the United States. They went to Brazil, had the most 4.8, I believe, million of the 11 or 12 million that were forced over. The Caribbean. And as Dr. Torres was saying, that was even more brutal work. They had to continue to replace slaves, meaning enslaved peoples, meaning they had to keep bringing more over because of the harsh environment and the dehumanization that is slavery as an entire institution. So it gets difficult to find necessarily where your outrage may lie if it comes to policy and politics, or where your community may lie if you straddle so many of them. But often for me, I find that can be a strength. I mean, there's a lot of people who say, I didn't fit in one place, I didn't fit in another. But I think that forces people to have to traffic in those spaces with some sort of confidence that you belong there, because that is, you can't kick me out just because I'm not what you think I'm supposed to look like as a Latina or as a Black woman. I can't help you with those types of problems. That's just, the reality of what my lineage and heritage and identity is. And so when you're able to straddle different communities, you can see things differently. I can liken this to when you become a parent. You see things completely different as someone who is not in that day-to-day, minutia of what is important, how to organize your day, what it is that your child needs individually. When you hear things as a parent, they strike you differently. When you hear things in spaces that maybe you haven't been in before, or your community hasn't had a voice in before, you hear things differently. You hear things differently as a brown woman or as a Black woman who have a variety of issues that are important to you. So I think a strength in that is that it forces you to be able to communicate throughout these different communities. And I think it helps in discussions like these where we're trying to bridge gaps where we have way more similarities oftentimes than we have differences. And even in those differences, we have strengths within those as well.
Thank you for that thoughtful response, Mo. And I just really want to quickly thank everybody who's joining us today for this conversation. Adelia, I see that you made a couple of comments, but I want to bring this one up. Ni de aquí, ni de allá. Not from here, not from there. So this idea of in between, some people call that nepanta. We're everywhere. Hakima, I'm going to call on you. I'm really interested in your take on Mo's comments, but also I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit about, from a perspective of white supremacy, why would it be beneficial for us to be grouped into just monolithic groups, right? So Black or Latinx and nothing in between.
Well, I think the monoliths always serve white supremacy. Because that serves to rob us of our individualized identities and just sort of lump us into categories. Even to say I'm Black, which I do, does not tell the whole story. Saying that I'm Black, you might assume that I'm ADOS, an American descendant of the enslaved. And that would be correct. That is how I identify, but that's not the totality of who all is caught in that catchment net of Blackness. There Caribbean, so I consider myself African American. Someone of Caribbean descent might not consider themselves African American at all. And then you have foreign born Black folks who are from other countries in the world. So I think that serves white supremacy very well when we get lumped into these large categories that don't really define who we are, because there's, as Mo said, there's so many subcategories to that, and each of those is important and help to define us as people groups.
Thank you for that, Hakima. Dr. Torres, you mentioned 3 different ways of identifying, right? You said that you're Mexican American, that you see yourself as Chicana, that you see yourself as Latina. Tell me, I think that can be confusing to a lot of people, and maybe not just in the majority community, but people in general. I'm interested, from your perspective as a Latina, can you talk about the different ways that Latinos identify in general, and maybe if you can provide some historical context as to why we identify in certain ways?
Well, I mean, I think that if you took a poll from a lot of people today, what we would find, a lot of what we'd say, the Latinos peoples that are living in the United States. There was one done by the Pew Research Center, and what they found was that people tended to go into different categories. One would say, I'm American, don't put me in any categories other than being American. That's who I am, that's how I identify. Others would say, well, like I said, I'm Mexican American, and that's how my grandparents and my mother and my extended family, which is very large, it talks about when I was growing up, okay? So that's where I saw who I was. I was Mexican American in a rural white town, okay, where we were the token color and the one Black lady who lived next door to my aunt. And that's it. Didn't know anybody else that was of a color. And so I think part of it's our background. Who taught us our identity? Who stressed the importance in our history? Okay, so that's one aspect. The other part is the whole identity of pulling us all together in a pan-Latino group, and now there's a whole discussion about Latinx versus Latino. So as part of my program of studies at UMKC, I've been part of the Latinx and Latin American Studies program. Well, we first were Latina/Latino, and then the students said, that's too binary. We need to be inclusive of everyone, and they made a really good case. And so it was the students, the millennial students, and that came along and said, educated us. Don't make us binary. We need to recognize that there are some people who are in the middle or don't want to identify as male or female. And so that's when the whole concept of Latinx came up, and some people are still pushing against it. And there are a lot of people who don't like that term, okay? But just so you know, that came out of kind of a groundswell of younger people studying their identities in Latinx studies, or Mexican American, or Puerto Rican American, or Dominican American. They wanted to have some kind of way to be inclusive. And so to try to kind of build a little bit more of a grouping of identity, and also I think for policy reasons and political reasons, the whole concept of Latino or Latina came about, and it used to be Hispanic. But that was something put upon us by the US government, and it was used in the census. So there was a push against using that. And so that's when the whole idea of using Latino versus Hispanic. But you'll still hear some people using that. But I think there can be adverse parts of putting us all in one point, which I think Mo explained really well. But there are also there are some advantages to use that string in numbers to say, hey, note that there's a growing population and demographic in the United States, and you cannot ignore us. It isn't just Black versus white. It is a diversity of peoples in this country that are being excluded. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. And I can do a whole show on the term Latinx. I definitely have thoughts, but not for tonight. I'm actually reminded of a conversation that we had with Rosa Clemente, who Puerto Rican, and the title of her conversation was like, "But I'm not Black." Justice, I'm gonna kick it to you because I think sometimes in the Latino community, we have to address colorism, we have to address anti-Blackness, but sometimes I think we use terms in order to distance ourselves away from the concept of Blackness. What are your thoughts on that? Like, have you seen that happen before?
Yeah, absolutely. Nail on head. Yay. Bringing us right to where we need to be. Yes. And I was just jotting some things down, I think about stereotypes and bias and how that plays into how people see themselves and how they want to be identified. The pull to push away from anything Black because to help maintain really social order and control is really what this whole thing is about. And so if we can drive a wedge using color, then that's what's happened, right? And so, even you talk about people who have the same needs not working together. In fact, one may be working very actively against the other and against their own self-interest, but at least I ain't Black is the sentiment. And that has been the historical sentiment. Talking to people who are immigrants. And, they've told me, through my work, Mo and I both work, y'all know, for the ACLU of Missouri. And we do a lot of work on immigrant rights. And speaking to different people from different places, I have heard consistently that they have been told, when you get to the United States, stay away from Black people. They are troublemakers. All of the things, they are problematic. Assimilate. You want to be as close to white culture as you possibly can. That's where success is, right? That's where, you can really be somebody. And so some people hold on to that. They're like, yeah, I want to have a successful family. I want to, have this American dream. And they will do that. They will build their lives in that way. And so, yeah, I see it very clearly. And it's been incentivized, right? To be racist, to be anti-Black is incentivized. And so there are many like pitfalls that people drop into because of that. But it's really about maintaining that social order and control to what benefit, what capitalism, which is what equal and equates to white supremacy.
If I could just jump in real quick, because I just wanted to hop on the end of what Justice was saying. As Dr. Torres was saying, it's very diverse. And so it's hard to have one voice a lot of times when for any community, quite frankly. We're talking politics, we're talking census. But like Justice was pointing out, these are systemic limitations and restrictions that are put on us that at the end of the day separate us. Just part of the differences in that include our religion. The vast majority of people who are Hispanic or Latinx are Catholic or follow some sort of Catholic or Christian background. And part of the reason that they were able to create these different caste systems that differentiated race as far as are you mixed with indigenous and Black and European, to what percentage, what are your children? In places like Brazil, sometimes it's called the branqueamento, the whitening of the family, the ability to, you know, remove Blackness from family from one to the next, and the caste systems and status that you were able to get from that. That system is a function of white supremacy and the ability to, you know, take out the stain of Blackness or remove the identity of some sort of African ancestry. Even in the title, it's why can't we just get along? It's quite frankly often not our communities that aren't getting along. It's the imposition of how to assimilate and become American. As Dr. Torres was saying, a lot of people will identify as American first and foremost. Growing up in the Midwest as as the diversity, as the check mark for so many programs and schools. And I always say all my flags are red, white, and blue, but I don't just have one. I have my Paraguayan, my Dominican, and my American flag. So part of that assimilation and need to push away from what is not a power center in this country, specifically, and that is why a lot of these issues that we have are so similar. We can't just assimilate our way out of racism. There are people in this country that they quite frankly don't want a lot of us here, let alone a lot of us mixing together and having the identities that we have that are not homogenous. And part of the problem in the United States, which is different than places like Brazil, on the census, it says white and Black. In a place like Brazil, there are 134 different ways that you can identify yourself in your Black identity or your African heritage. Do I think that people may have some way to find more identity or find more community or find more connections and find where, some of that diversity is the same type of a strength, and the difference in culture and the difference in what you're bringing to the table? Maybe. But we don't have that in this country necessarily. And some of that ties to the type of system that was created here, which was a lot of that one drop rule, a lot of that paper bag test, a lot of that. And you have places like New Orleans where there were a mix of Creole and mixed with, and there still was a different type of caste system that put so many people in the same undesirable bucket at the end of the day. So, the overlying issue with why so many communities can't get along, particularly in the United States, is white supremacy and how that plays out in so many different places. And I know a lot of the conversation with a lot of people of Dominican descent, they don't claim to be Black because in their country, that is not how they would identify themselves or put themselves in a bucket. And that in and of itself, comes from a function of how white supremacy plays out in that country. As people in the United States, it would be pretty messed up to point at other countries and say, you have some effed up race stuff, because, a lot of them learned it from us, quite frankly, and a lot of them copied it after us. And so I just want to point out that, even in places where there are Black people that speak Spanish or there are Black people that speak Portuguese, that same type of white supremacist, undesirable, get away from Blackness somehow in your heritage, branqueamento, whitening out your heritage, is the problem that is at the root of so many, the cause at the root of so many problems.
I appreciate that, Mo, and you're reminding me of some of my members of my family who would encourage our cousins or our family members to marry white, right, and then to talk about mejorando la raza, or improving the race. Before I go into any other conversations, just want to make sure to acknowledge the community that are with us today. Delia says, I didn't learn about our roots history until I went to college. I grew up wondering why we had a tia güera and a tío güero. We use terms like negro and negra on my Puerto Rican side as terms of endearment. For our darker skinned family members, we have indigenous looking family members we called India or Ibarra. We knew of our diverse ethnicity, but didn't know our history. A lot of us don't know our history, right? And I think that that's also a function of white supremacy, because the less knowledge we have of who we are, the less ideas if we have of who we are, where we come from, the easier it is to assimilate. Or what's forceful assimilation? I guess that would be like genocide to a certain extent. I could be wrong on that. Abe.
But I think it plays out in even in more subtle ways, right? We talk about microaggressions in different communities, but you know, again, growing up in the Midwest, the town I grew up in was probably 85 to 90% white. Pre-internet, this is a place where families were told, you know, don't speak Spanish at home. That might make it harder for them to understand or move forward in school, or, you know, those little things, or being told your name sounds funny because it's spelled with an accent, or it, you know, has a letter in there that maybe in English you don't see all the, or maybe you do, just something that people see is from a different background. And it starts early. You know, kids are being told you're weird because you have a different name, or because your family may be immigrants. You know, I'm first generation. I was born here, but people still ask me, where are you from? And look at me crazy when I say Missouri. I'm, you know, and again, I think that touches to some of the identity conversation from the beginning. You can't tell me I'm not from here. You can't tell me this isn't my identity. This is my life. This is what I've lived. These are my experiences. And that plays out differently in different places. I think with the language piece as well, there are a lot of first generation, second generation Latinx, Latino people who don't speak Spanish. And part of that is because of, you know, assimilation and how that has played out and manifested in different ways. So, I mean, we can get into how the US likes to play in other people's politics and has played in Latin America to practice all kinds of nonsense and coups and whatnot. Don't think we have time for that now, but you know, the United States really, the way that it has created our melting pot is not always by including all the ingredients.
Can I jump into, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
I love this conversation, and I want to point out two films that I'd highly recommend. And they're both available for free on YouTube. One is Harvest of Empire, which Mo just talked about, and it tells you the history of U.S. intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay, so they give you kind of a little bit of a short history lesson, but through the lives of real people as you go through these countries, and so it's an excellent film. Another one is Black in Latin America, and that is Henry Louis Gates's film series that's also available on YouTube for free. So I highly recommend those two because it really addresses a lot more than what we can cover in this short period of time. I use it for my classes, and so I wanted also to explain two things that the whole idea of the one drop was about. If you had one drop of being black, then you could not be considered white, even if you were as white, you know, skinned. But a lot of people passed, and that's part of that. And the other one was the paper bag. You know, you put yourself, whether you were darker or lighter, depending upon your skin color, held up the bag, and that determined whether where you were on that scale towards whiteness or blackness or brownness. Okay, and so I want to talk a little just in my own family and just kind of give you another example of how whiteness worked. My grandmother, who we found out her whole roots were, you know, indigenous. She was part of the native peoples of Mexico, had this horrible, she would talk about India, she called them Los Indios, in such a pejorative manner that she had internalized the oppression in her very self and denied her very heritage and history that she was not aware of. And the other one was the whole, we had my uncle Chavo, who was a black Mexican American. I loved him very much, but it was obvious he was black, and the experience that he encountered and his children encountered haunt me to this day, because like you said, there's like Edgar said, you know, I grew up never thinking about that he was black. He was my uncle, you know, but the reality of what happened to the children not being accepted and then growing up in the Midwest, they grew up in Omaha, that whole experience of rejection because of being being Black and how horrific it was. And that was not the same with the rest of my family, because my grandfather told his daughters, you marry white, don't marry Black, don't marry Mexican, marry white, okay? And I was shocked when he said, don't marry, my mother told me, don't marry Mexican, okay? And I look at my cousins who don't identify as Latino, even though many of them are dark-skinned, and so I wonder how all that comes out into their own life when they encounter discrimination because of the color of their skin. So anyway, colorism is alive and well, and even if people deny it, does not mean that it does not exist and that they won't encounter it. And it wasn't until I left my small town in Iowa and I began to understand the whole construction of race and its impact in our lives that I realized my internalized oppression and how it had affected me. And I had internalized the stereotypes, as well as this sense of I was not good enough, imposter syndrome. And once I was able to get past that and understand that, how that impacted me, it was a wow, but I had to go. I didn't get anything, unlike Delia, who said she didn't study anything about being Latina or Latino in this, or Latinx in the United States until she went to college. I had to do it in graduate school at the Mexican American Cultural Center in San Antonio. So I just say we need more education because it will empower young people. And that's why I teach what I do at UMKC.
I appreciate that. There's a couple of thoughts that I'm having. One, something that we don't often talk about is the cost of assimilation. And the cost of losing your cultural identity, and how that impacts you for the rest of your life, right? And so the people who deny their heritage, who deny their roots, so to speak, we want to pretend like assimilation, is equivalent to safety in America, which it's not. I think it's there's a cost to it, and I really wish we spoke more about that within our communities. And then I also think about, like, Mo, you've mentioned this a couple of times, people robbing you of your identity. And sometimes I think within our communities, we tend to rob each other of, we tend to say, like, there's been a couple of times in my life where I've taken somebody's Latino card with no right to do that. Who am I to take somebody's identity away from them, right? Or how they identify. And so I think about that. I don't know if it's the same in other communities, but I would love to hear just a little bit more of your experiences with maybe how people try to rob your identity, and how that makes it even more difficult to feel like you belong to a certain extent.
Yeah, well, sometimes I have found, and in having conversations with other first-gen kids of all stripes, from Africa, from Asia, from all kinds of other places, in places where you are that diversity, race is weirdly not discussed because it's your responsibility, right? It's that old adage of, like, we start talking about slavery in class, and so everyone looks at the Black kid and it's like, how do the Black people feel about this? And you're like, what? First of all, I'm in school, same as you. We're here, figuring this all out together. That's a lot to, in that sense, put on one person. But for a lot of my childhood, growing up with other kids, it wasn't a topic of discussion. It wasn't, especially if they, I grew up in the suburbs. So there was a certain amount of, oh, well, you're white, or you're the good ones that got out or did some sort of, because you got here, I guess that it's fine to be here with us. Right. And so, I think it manifests itself in some of that representation as well. Everyone around me was also white. The teachers were white, the doctors are white. I found it so weird that I didn't have a Black teacher until I was in college. And I went to school at the University of Maryland for my undergrad degrees. I that was even then, though, you know, Maryland is still a PWI. I think it was my junior year. So it's not a problem that is specific to the Midwest necessarily. It's not a problem that's specific to either coast or just rural areas. But I think that when you step in spaces and people assume, and like Justice was saying, put their stereotypes on you, put what they assume of you. I've been asked before, oh, but your dad's not like regular Black, right? Like I'm like, what? Okay, now we need definitions on what you think. Like, what do you think that is? And why do you think, you know, if you speak Spanish, why would that not be, you know? And again, it's beating a dead horse, but it's having to compare everything to the norm, which in the United States is white, English. And so, you know, I was born here, but my parents got their citizenship. So they're an American the same as everyone else. And a lot of our politics and our policy language, it gets divisive because people will use language that tries to dehumanize people, even those who, you know, are here the same as you and I. Your family could have been here from the revolution and I was just born here, and these are my roots too. And sometimes it startles me how upset people will get at first gens having such strong feelings for the United States. Like, these are our roots too, right? This is my home. You can't tell me I'm not from the middle of nowhere, Missouri. This is my life. But part of it is that assimilation, because we aren't taught a zoomed out view of the rest of the world. If I want to learn about my country, I have to go, or my history of my family. Those are other countries. Those are separate and apart conversations that may or may not have anything to do with the United States. So I think part of the strength of the Latinx community, in part, is that we are able to have that zoomed out view. And it's not just the United States centric at all times. And so that's a separate and apart community that you belong to, whether or not you're in a place like the United States, or sometimes more repressive smaller towns or states and cities where your identity is not welcomed at all times.
Thank you for that, Mo. I'm just going to bring in Carlos Urquía Diaz. I agree that we Latinos rob each other of who we are. Latinos come from 21 Spanish-speaking countries. We are in 5 major immigration categories, and at times we fight each other to the point that it can turn into racism. We need to get our houses in order first before we point fingers to others. Thank you for your comment, Carlos. A lot to unpack there. You know, a lot to unpack in these conversations. Well, you said, I mean, this is painful stuff at the end of the day, right? I think that you talked about, you know, this is my country. Like, you can't tell me I'm not from here. And it made me really focus on this idea of my own journey with identity. When I was born in Miami, I definitely felt American, but I was definitely Nicaragüense, right? Like, there was this part of my life where I was Nicaragüense. I was maybe secondary Latino, but Nicaragüense, and then for sure American. And then I moved to Spokane, Washington, where I became Mexican. I don't know how, but I became Mexican because everybody thought I was Mexican. And then I became othered, and, you know, I had big lips and black hair or brown hair, and that was weird. And then I've learned all the other names that come along with Latino identity, the slurs and whatnot. Then I moved to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and somehow I became Hispanic there, right? That wasn't a term I utilized, but I became Hispanic. And then I came to Kansas City, where I finally settled on Latino, and then I finally settled on Latinx. But the identity that I don't lead with is American. And so now I got to go to therapy because of that. So I appreciate you sharing that. But I don't know if anybody else on this esteemed panel shares that the struggle of you start with one identity, and then throughout your life you shift, and then your leading identity isn't who you how it began. And so I don't know if anybody shares a similar trajectory or not.
I had something like that. And I think it was because I grew up in, like I said, my family and this other neighbor were the people of color in our whole town of about 1,000 people. And so I had a sense of pride from my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, and I heard Spanish in the home. And the teachers told the kids not to speak Spanish, but they went home and they had to talk to their dad, so they had to speak Spanish. But they never got the kind of fluency. And then after he died, it just wasn't used that much. But I spoke Spanish because I had an aunt who had a cognitive disability, and so she spoke Spanglish, and then she'd just go off into Spanish. And I wanted to understand, and when you're little, you're a sponge, so I got it. And so I understood it, but then when I went to kindergarten, I found out I spoke a different language and didn't know that, because my neighborhood kids would all learn. We were all sponges. They learned everything that I learned, and they got it. And so I had to learn that I was different. And then they sent me to a speech therapy, and they took away my accent, and they took away my ability to speak Spanish in the way that I would have had I been allowed to keep that. Because to them, I had an accent. There was something wrong with me. So they sent me to a speech pathologist. So years later, I'm after college, and I'm in Latin America going to classes and we're practicing how to say things in Spanish. And all of a sudden I had a flashback of first grade going to the speech therapist and realizing that I was now paying to get back, which was my right to speak correctly Spanish. And now I had to pay for it, and it was taken away from me. And I kind of rejected that in high school. I rejected wanting to know more about Spanish, rebellion, teenage years. And then I said, well, I want to take French. My mother said, if you're not taking any language if you're not taking Spanish. So I didn't take any language in high school. I got to college and I said, stupido, I should have taken Spanish in high school. It would have been a lot easier, so I had to keep working on it. I still work on it. I'm not as fluent as I want to be, not should. I don't have to. And I worked through the whole identity issue of that in my 30s. And it was because I finally understood how racism worked. And so I highly recommend going into that deep dive of understanding how this has affected you, because then I have the strength and knowledge of who I am, and I know how to resist. And I have my uncle's first wife died. His second wife has told me that, she doesn't see me as Latina. And I'm like, what do you see me? It's like, I have the right to claim who I am. Whether you see me that way or not, I am. I claim who I am, And so in that way, that's what I've had other people say that, I don't, and they think that by being colorblind, and that's an important part of white race talk, is it's not just whites, because we do it to each other too. So, but that's part of racist talk that is part of the oppressive system that we live in, taking away our voices and our identity and putting us into boxes and categories, and to resist that and to say and claim who we are, and to acknowledge that this is all part of that whole construction of categories of the closer you are to this level, the higher up you are in society. We don't need to buy into that. And we need to struggle and to push against that, and make allies with others who think are like-minded. So I'll shut up.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Abe, you haven't had the opportunity to speak yet, so I want to make sure that your voice is included in this. What are your thoughts thus far?
Yeah, man. There are a lot of thoughts. Particularly, I think there are some even differences as we think about geographically within the U.S. of how people understand and interpret identity. So I'm from Mississippi, and growing up in Mississippi, I moved here probably 8 years ago. But growing up in Mississippi, you were either black, white, Latino, or Chinese. So it's like, you were one of those four identities. Now, obviously, there's a lot more identity than that. So even the conversation around embracing multiple identities and things like that it's still, to me, I'm still even learning a lot about people embracing multiple identities, including myself, whatever those multiple identities may be outside. Is there anything outside of I'm Black? But I guess it's just, I'm always thinking through. Again, we go through how we grow up. That was the environment. You were one of those four things. Even moving here to Kansas City some years ago, hearing this idea around, and I think a lot of it is people sharing different thoughts on social media as well, but even thoughts around a person that is, even just Black and white, saying like, oh, I'm Black and I'm white. It was, growing up for me personally, like I said, in Mississippi, it's like you were Black. Yeah, we saw your mom or your dad and they are white, but you're Black. And I would even venture to say my friends who were maybe Black and white, they would even say the same. I actually had a friend, I asked her one time, I was like, hey, your mom is cool. What's that like, having a white mom? Like, how does that, what does that mean to you? And I remember she was like, what are you talking about? I was like, like, because you're Black and white. She was like, I'm Black. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, I stopped asking questions. But, and then I came to Kansas City. It's like this, I think it's the environment, though, where we've been having this conversation. This conversation is not happening in many places in the Deep South. So, it's even for me, a lot of times I'm even listening and like, oh, that's different. Like, okay, yeah, you are multiple identities. You're not just you are what you identify as. So, I'm still kind of even listening to that when it comes to how we identify along racial lines and things like that.
I
So
appreciate
there's
that,
just
Dave,
some
and you're
full
absolutely right. Like, we
transparency.
carry multiple identities. We're not just one thing, right? Quickly want to
Yep.
bring in some folks from the community.
Yep.
Rhonda, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Dr. Torres, can you share the name of those YouTube movies again? I recently purchased The Presumed Alliance. Excited to start reading it.
Okay, the movies are Harvest of Empire by Juan Gonzalez. So I'll say it again, Harvest of Empire, and it's for free on YouTube. You're going to see some short ones, but keep looking for the one that says full movie. The other one is easy. It's Henry Louis Gates, Black in Latin America. And so but they're all, that's a series. It's not just one, the Black in Latin America. It's excellent. And I show it I show both movies in my class. I have a class called Race and Ethnic Relations that I teach online at UMKC. I'm part of a new department. I wanted to put that in. It's at UMKC. It's called REGS, shortened for Race, Ethnic, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And earlier we had 3 different programs: Black Studies, Latinx and Latin American Studies, and then Women, Gender, and Sexuality programs. And we're working towards getting majors in the new REGS department. But we're still teaching the classes as we have in the past. And I often I'm teaching another class called Latinx and Black Health and Mental Health and Inequality. And so particularly now with COVID, more people are aware of the disparities that impact our lives and make us more susceptible to, COVID-19. I mean, there's just so many things that people are now being aware of that weren't before, and how that just social and income disparities, are schools that are unequal, all of that have created this perpetuation of inability to move forward when you don't have the same level playing field that a lot of people assume happened. Because we all have free public school, yeah, but some schools have really good resources, like excellent top-notch computers, and some schools don't even have the best building, let alone technology, for them to compete at the same playing field. So we have to acknowledge that inequality, and then the long-term effects are how it affects us in general in education, and so being able to survive and move ahead in education.
Thank you for that, Dr. Torres. And just so the community knows, the links are somewhere in the comments. I made sure to put those links to the YouTube videos somewhere in the comments there. Delia says, American. Latinos are American, Latin American, North American, South American, the Americas, Las Americas. USA has stolen the America from all the Americas. United Stations. Or as they say in Spanish, Estadounidenses, right?
Right.
Yeah, I remember going to Nicaragua for the first time and being like, I'm American. And they're like, we are too. And I was like, no, you're not. That was awkward for me. Carlos Urquía Diaz, I was born in El Salvador to a Mexican mother, half Salvadoreño and half Spaniard dad. I joined the military and spent 15 years in the army. I was never fully accepted by some Mexicans, some Salvadoreños or Españoles. In the USA, whites call me Mexican. I was only called American in the military when I was stationed overseas. I had to go to the Middle East, Europe, and other countries to be seen as American. The first time I was called Latino, like right out loud, was in Spain, and I was so proud that day. I was like, finally, somebody sees me the way I see myself. And then, Glenetta, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Black. I find it hard to claim my native heritage because I don't know anything about it. I'm also adopted, and my mom is a Filipina. Our identities are complex, y'all. Justice, I saw you on mute.
Yeah, because, I resonate with that. I hear the stories and I can look in my grandmother's face and know there's indigenous blood there. And I see it and I know the stories that she tells me about her grandmother. And that's the tragedy of slavery and how some of us arrived here. I see myself still as a captive on this land. I see my people as captives because, slaves weren't taken from Africa. People were and made to slave and toil and work lands. People who have heritage and history. And one thing I can't do is I don't know what my people's native language is. I don't know. I I only know so much about myself. This is the state of a lot of people who were taken from Africa. And when I look at people in Africa who can just tell and just name the people, they can just go back generation after generation of who their family is. And knowing that there's the people that were taken can't do that. And there's like a void there. So I just wanted to say that I resonate with that. And the one thing that is very clear to me is that there was clearly a group who sought control over other peoples and has used taking away our language, taking away our culture, our humanity, all of it, and forcing their ways upon us. I mean, you were mentioning, Dr. Torres, about equity, about equal. I was thinking about that. Edgar, you mentioned a little bit earlier about, well, I'll just say what I was really thinking about. Separate but equal came to mind. Also, before integration, I see thriving Black communities. I see, Black teachers, Black schools, Black hospitals, Black doctors, whole Black communities thriving before integration. And then when you have this integration, here you have, not to say that it was perfect, because it wasn't. We knew that we weren't getting the funds that we should have been getting. But it seemed as though we had the right people in place. When there was a Black teacher who could stand before you and you felt safe in that teacher's classroom, that's something that is sorely lacking right now. Our safe spaces. You knew you were going to have a Black doctor. You knew your nurse was Black. You knew the midwife was Black, and that they were going to take care of you in a way that's very different than what we have going on right now. And so, y'all, it's just a mix of stuff, and it's all over the place. But at the end of the day, it's very clear to me that it's all about controlling and maintaining a specific social order.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment on integration. And, I'm often reminded of the fact that it wasn't white students who went into Black schools or Latino schools. It was Black and brown students who were integrated into white schools, right? The idea that, again, whiteness was the standard, was the way to go. And so I often wonder, like, what would have happened had it been flipped? What would have happened had white students integrated into Black and brown communities? And, what would we see today because of that? We are nearing time, and I know we could talk about this for hours. So I'm going to actually just go around the panel and see and kind of give us your final thoughts. And I'm going to give you an order this specifically. So I'm going to go with Mo, Dr. Torres, then Ave, then Justice, then Hakima, because Hakima always knows how to close us out in a spirit of solidarity and from a place of healing. So I want to make sure that she gets the final word in this space. So I forgot the order, but I think I started with Mo.
Yeah. Part of what Justice was touching on is a sense of moving forward and progressing is in continuing to celebrate our history and recognizing our accomplishments in each community, overlapping communities, the ability to have part of this conversation and why, growing up, some of us were labeled one thing and not labeled another, is the terms and language that we have access to right now. And to have these conversations, we needed to be able to expand and be more inclusive. I mean, the Latinx term itself takes into account this gender inclusion that we're trying to do here in the United States, trying to grow in the English language. But that's not something necessarily done in the Spanish language that is gender binary in the way that it operates. The terms that we're able to use in order to talk to and about and with one another, the recognition of our history and struggle and welcoming in different spaces and communities, being able to walk into a space, Justice talks about integration, being able to walk into a space like Howard, where I went for school, my dad went for school, and I've had a white person say, I don't even know what it would be like to go in there. There's just, you have all Black people on the wall. And I'm like, the whole rest of the world that you see is the opposite. And I'm intended to operate in that world the same as you. Welcome to the rest of the world, and how the rest of us have to see things and switch and traffic through these different spaces. So, I just hope that the ability to open up these discussions with the community, to bridge some of the differences that we have, and move forward truly as people who can, in this country at least, create a better country for each and every one of us and our communities that are so intertwined and so lovingly dependent on each other and our ability to progress as people as a whole, I think.
Great, Mo. I guess I'm the next one. First of all, it has been a pleasure and an honor to be part of this panel. I feel that we need more opportunities to talk with each other and to find our commonalities. And I think, and one of the things that I want to talk about is also that we have white allies who want to better understand, who don't come from our diverse realities and perspectives in the way in which we have. And I see this with my students at UMKC who take the classes that I offer. that are about diverse issues and sincerely want to learn. They're not just taking it because it's a credit. I'll ask them, well, I'm really interested. Why? Why are you in this class? And they're just really upfront and honest. So I think we can learn from those who want to be our allies. And one thing that I want to say that is that those of us who are people of color is that we deal with difference on a regular basis. And difference can be very good, but it's often in the dominant discourse in our society that difference equals bad. And because it makes certain people feel uncomfortable when they walk into, like you said, they would feel uncomfortable walking into Howard as a white person. Okay, I used to teach an anthropology class, and I would challenge the students, the white students, to go into an area where they were the only white person, or there would be maybe just a few people. And how did they feel? And that was my way of challenging them to look more deeply into allowing themselves to feel what it's like to be different. It's okay. Being uncomfortable is part of education. Being uncomfortable is just part of life. And if we really want to get along and understand each other, we're going to have to walk into uncomfortable spaces. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how we grow. And so I appreciated the opportunity to talk today. It wasn't uncomfortable for me because I try to do this, but I don't always have it at such a broad platform. So I welcome that. And I have my close Black friends who challenge me, point out the things that I didn't see, that I have my colorblind lenses on, that I have this, oh my gosh, yes, that's my small town Evoca View glasses that I have on today. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how did that happen? So I have to admit and apologize and say, I've got to focus on that. And so that's what I want to say is that's our next conversation. How do we build these bridges across difference and acceptance of one another, where we are and what stage we're at? Edgar was talking about, looking at his identity in depth. We're all on different stages of this. And so that's what I am grateful for this opportunity. I'm grateful. I want you to all consider coming to our next event that we're going to have to talk about how to build coalitions. So I was hoping we'd get to it, but we didn't. And I think we will. I know we will next time. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Just to follow that up, our next event actually will be after the new year, but around how do we build that solidarity and trust. We definitely all understood here and understand here that these are the honest conversations that we have to have if we're really going to build that solidarity. So again, thank you to the phenomenal panelists, Mo, Dr. Torres, for being here with us today. There's going to be a Google Doc that's been posted. We would love to keep in contact with people, update you on what's going on with this group. This group is particularly for those who identify as Black and or Latinx. So this is a space specifically for those who identify as Black and or Latinx. And with that, going into the new year, really what one of the key goals of this collaboration, this partnership between us all, is empowering Black and Latinx voices in policy and legislative advocacy work. I think more so probably over the past few years, just as much as any other time, we've really seen the importance of being as deeply involved in the policy spaces. Being able to really advocate for the needs within our own communities and understanding what tools are at hand for us to take ownership of that. And so Black and Latinx communities have been historically most hardest hit in times of crisis. And so we do want to understand the tools that we have at hand that we can take advantage of and be able to use. But before we can get to that, we really have to build that solidarity, be like-minded, and see that we all have a common goal here. And so again, that document will be posted. So would love to keep in contact with people, have people come on board. Would love to hear even ideas on how we continue to move that solidarity forward. So with that, I'll pass it on to Justice.
Sure. Sure. So, final thoughts for me. For me, it's all about building power and really developing authentic relationships, so that when we build this power, we're able to use it most effectively. Um, as what Ave mentioned is really the heart of where I really like to be. Um, because we can be in the streets all day. We can march, we can shout, we can protest, we can do a number of things. But unless we're getting back and really going back to the table, sitting down at the kitchen table and really taking a look at the policies in place that make it so that folks can discriminate against us, make it so that police can continue to shoot us down in the street. Until we do that, we're not going to really effectively change much. And so, and it's not just policy. I'm not saying that either, because that's a piece of paper too, but it's a piece of paper with weight. Um, it's about policy, but it's also about the hearts and minds of people. And so when both of those are right, we can do a whole lot. We can do a whole lot together. And we have so much more in common than we don't. We have so much more in common. Um, when I think about, the things that the Trump administration did with family separation, when I think about what we learned about people being sterilized, women being forced sterilization, I mean, it mirrors what Black women have endured in this country for years, for generations. And so there is a commonality there in the sorrow and in the pain that we share. There can also be a commonality in the victory that we win. And so if we're not invited to tables, it's okay. We can build our own tables. We just need to get to the point where we are working together, right? And that doesn't mean that we have to agree. We can agree to disagree. That doesn't mean that we can't have an argument or we can't have a fight. Families fight. If we're family, we're gonna fight sometimes, and that's okay. It is okay. But it really is about building up that power, respecting each other, showing each other love, and you know, we know we got this. We know we can do this. And as a matter of fact, we have to do this. We have to do this. So I'm gonna stop there and let Mama Hakima take us out.
I finish us up. I love this conversation. I'm honored to have been a part of it. And I just want to end by focusing on the personal, because white supremacy has diminished us all. It's left us all bereft of knowledge of who we truly are, our true identity, and that diminishes us as individual people, let alone within our corporate groups. And that's true of white people too. They are diminished and also robbed of their knowledge and understanding of their ethnic bearings. And so this is an important journey, as Justice mentioned. It's a journey we should all be on. We all are on, to discover more and more and more of our history, to embrace that history as we know it, to come to love it, because that broadens us holistically as human beings. And we're constricted and confined by these issues of identity and colorism. That's all enmeshed under this umbrella of racism and how it expresses itself in this country. But the road to freedom from all that is in knowing, understanding, loving, and embracing our identities as separate and distinct and as nuanced as those are. They all make up what is our full humanity, which is waiting for us to embrace it. So thank you, Edgar, for this discussion. Thank you for our esteemed guests for joining us to have this discussion. And thank you to our audience for being with us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Yeah.